Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our talk tonight, and welcome Leon. It's nice to have you with us. And we're sort of kicking off our talks for 2023, and we're looking forward to more talks to come. I think a lot of you know Leon and have followed his talks. I got an email today where someone was saying they so enjoy Leon's talks, they're thinking of studying Lacanian psychoanalysis. So I thought that was quite nice. Okay, so Leon is a psychoanalytic theorist and a psychological counselor from Berlin. Leon's work draws from Freudian and Lacanian traditions of psychoanalysis, and his interest lies in the understanding of the relationship between culture and psychopathology. His book, The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language, was a bestseller in psychology in the Palgrave Springer Publishing of 2021. He is the founder of Lacanian Infinities Berlin and Unconscious Berlin, and is currently a research fellow at the International Psychoanalytic University of Berlin. And let's see if I say it right, the Hans Kilian und Lotta Koller Centrum. And it's lovely to have you tonight, Leon. I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, as always. And as always, nice to see some familiar faces today. Thanks for joining us. Yes, so everyone that's showing their faces, I actually know and have seen and appreciate for coming again. I see Sam, Alice, Manuel, Rosanna, George, Julia, thank you for joining. Oh, Sanem is also joining us. So great, fantastic. You see, when you show me your face, I remember it, and I can be confident that you are in fact real people. So I always ask if you can join us with the camera. That would make it as though it is an actual event where we meet each other. Thank you so much. Okay. So I told Mike that we're going to do a talk against reality. And this little talk developed into an idea for a three-part series. So we'll see about that. We'll see where we get to today. And I might invite you to another talk and another one. We'll see at the end. I won't spoil my plans, but we'll see where we get to. And as I'm used to doing in the beginning of my lectures or my seminars at the university, I take it as a little pleasure to begin with some provocation. So we'll begin with that. And I'll begin by saying, and this is from my own experience with my friends and friends group, that, well, there are always, every friend group has someone who defines themselves as a realist. And I think that there is nothing more perverse than being a realist. And, well, this is a position that I think you will mostly find is occupied by men who necessarily flaunt their possession of something that, in the ancient mysteries would be called the phallus. But today, in our more scientific civilization, well, we refer to it as an objective reality. A reality that all of us, sadly, we might say, mostly unwittingly share. Now, the realist, well, he flaunts his reality only to affirm it, not by a certain, let's say, a certain self-reflection, but actually through the effect that this flaunting of the reality produces in the victim. Yes, so we would say it's some kind of a splitting effect that this realist exhibitionism inflicts on the other. This is because it is impossible to see what actually lies under his well-nourished belly. It is the anxiety that the realist provokes in the other that is the only proof of his virility. Now, you know, I'm a big fan of Badiou, of Alain Badiou's philosophy, other than my interest in psychoanalysis. And Badiou has a very compelling list that he has created for the realists in his, at least his time, and the time of their 68 attempt at a revolution in France. And I'll just quote Badiou here. So who are the realists? So this is for Badiou. Veterans of lost wars, failed artists, intellectuals perverted by bitterness, dried up matrons, illiterate muscle-bound youths, shopkeepers ruined by capital, desperate unemployed workers, rancid couples, bachelor informants. Here, this one I identified the most. Academicians envious of the success of poets, atrabious professors, xenophobes of all stripes, mafiosi greedy for decorations, vicious priests, and cuckolded husbands. And this Badiou says, to this hodgepodge of ordinary existence offers the chance of a new destiny under the incomprehensible but salvific sign of an absolute body, whose only demand is the one serves it by nurturing everywhere and at all times the hatred of every living thought, every transparent language, and every uncertain becoming. It's a very harsh quote from Badiou, from his second book in the series, Being an Event. And if anyone's interested, you can email me and I'll send you the direct citation. Now, we're not going to deal with the question of reality in terms of Badiou's revolutionary politics. We'll be dealing with it from within the scope of the institution. Now, as you know, as all of you know, the loss of reality has been a concern of the institution for a very long time. And you can pick up Foucault's very famous book, The History of Madness. And you can see how Foucault describes a historical process where the question of the loss of reality, which he calls the question of madness, receives different interpretations which shape the formation of our modern day scientific society. There's a particular chapter in the book called The Great Internment, where Foucault describes how those who were deemed, let's say, as being separate from reality, from an objective reality, were confined in the same spaces where they had put the criminal, at that time, the beggar. They put them in the same place under the same circumstances, and that was the beginning of the great internment of the mad. Now, Foucault also says how many of the mad have returned to their homes since, particularly in the late 19th century, and today, of course, we see it as well. But what I want to argue in this series, or today at least, is that the authority of the practitioner on reality has not ceased to exist. And this authority, well, is naturally still a matter of the institutions, right? And this, you might all know, this thing called reality testing. The patient is applied to the institution, and then his connection with a reality is tested. And well, this is an institutional matter because it determines if one is committed to the institute or not, right? So you see how the question of reality and the authority that one has over it, well, clearly still remains a matter of the institution. But what I want to argue today is that this particular problematic of reality has also slithered out of the institution and attached itself to those new professions that were only cultivated there. And in other words, I might say that this particular problematic with the authority over reality shows itself in the realm of the psy-occupations, or what we might call psychotherapies. Now we see this, I don't know how many of you follow Twitter, and as you know, these algorithms, they commonly introduce you to people that have the same interests and occupations as yourself. And many times I see this very, I don't know how to call, I'll just say dumb colloquial use of Freud's reality principle. And, you know, the people that say, oh, the patient, I had to introduce him to the reality principle. And this is used colloquially, meaning I had to make him face the reality. These are the hard facts, right? But then I would say that this use of the authority of over reality is not a serious one. What I think is a more serious approach or serious implementation of this particular relationship, we actually see in very serious psychoanalytic interpretations of Freud's work. And we see that in many psychoanalyses that branch out, for instance, of Carl Abrams' developmental approach, what is also later called the genetic approach. And this is the idea that there is a certain adaptive sequence of psychosexual development, and that psychoanalysis entails a certain, well, for those poor people that didn't go through this proper sequence of development, we see the psychoanalyst adapting them to a sexuality, to even a sex that is genital. And that's always has puzzled me. What is genital sex? I've heard that it's quite amazing, but you only experience it after a very long analysis funded by the Abrams School. That's at least these analysts, they promise. I still think it's quite a mystery to me, and I doubt that they experience these realms of pleasure. But okay, this is a certain idea that is progressed there, and here we see a certain adaptation to what is the reality of one's sexuality, the genital stage of sexual development. Another point where we see serious important theories developed in these directions are what we might call the harsh translations of Melanie Klein's fantasy object dialectic. And what we see here is a certain, let's say, translation of her practice into a theory of identification with the psychoanalyst. And this means either with the psychoanalyst's ego or with his superego. So there are two ways to think about that. But in both cases, in both of these very important, let's say, trajectories in development of psychoanalysis, I think both are quite prominent even today. We see therapists that attempt to adapt the subject to a reality that they know is real. They know it because they've learned it, or, you know, they've experienced real sex, or, and this is what I hear many times with my students that study this, they've gained this access to reality through their training analysis. And in that way, they've rid themselves of all effects of the unconscious and can now position themselves in relation to reality. And in this sense, can bestow on the subject this access as well, this relationship as well. Now, okay, I'll admit I've presented these perspectives quite shorthandedly. I haven't delved deeply into them, and that's a good idea to do so. So we maybe even plan to do so together, because there is a lot more to say about that. But I'll just generally present these at this point and try and argue today that if we stick with Freud, if we stick with Freud's conception of reality, we would not be able to support any kind of idea that would refer us to any type of this adaptation of the subject to a reality. And I'll expose from the get-go a certain structure which would speak to the clinicians here, to those practitioners here. And I would say the following, that many times in psychoanalysis, we see a certain schema for the trajectory of the treatment, which begins with the analyst's interpretations, goes through the transference, and then ends with the adaptation of the subject to reality. And what I would like to say and to suggest to you today in this lecture, and if we make it into a series, even better, because I'll be able to give you some clinical examples later, that in the psychoanalysis, in the reading of Freud that I suggest to you, that I will suggest to you today, and this will be, yeah, Mike has already said, a Lacanian reading of Freud. The direction of the treatment is exactly the opposite. One begins with a certain situatedness in psychic reality, which, as you'll see today, is very much different than an adaptation to reality. So it's a different type of situatedness in reality. One begins the treatment there, moves through the transference, and only then gets to the point of interpretation. So it is a different route that one will take. Now, what I thought about doing today, I usually just rant for about an hour until people are quite tired and then there's some questions. But I thought about doing some reading with you today. Maybe we can share a certain handout I've created for you today. So I think we can send it on the chat. Here we go. So Michael has shared the file with you and you can open it today. And we're going to read some Freud together and then a little bit of Lacan. And we'll spend time working on this. It would be fantastic to hear some of your interpretations here instead of me just being a pedagogue, and giving you my interpretation of the text. But, it's Zoom, and many times we suffer from this Zoom silence of doom, right? So we'll see. We'll work with it as we progress. I usually torment one of my students to do the reading, but I'll do it for you today. It's fine. So I'll read a little bit from Freud. By the way, just to share with you something personal, I don't know if you've seen this Austrian show about Freud. It was on Netflix, so you can actually watch it on Netflix. And I love that show, not because it was good, it was very bad. But I love that show because now when I read Freud, I have in my mind this handsome Austrian actor reading out the text. So it's fantastic. So I suggest that you watch that show only so that you can have this experience. So imagine in your minds this young, dashing version of Freud reading this text out instead of myself. So let's open the first quote, which I brought from Freud's formulations on the two principles of mental functioning from 1911. And we'll begin with the first paragraph. So Freud says the following: in the psychology, which is founded on psychoanalysis, We have become accustomed to taking as our starting point the unconscious mental processes, with the peculiarities of which we have become acquainted through analysis. We consider these to be the older primary processes, the residues of a phase of development in which they were the only kind of mental process. The governing purpose obeyed by these primary processes is easy to recognize. It is described as the pleasure principle, the pleasure-unpleasure principle, Lust-Unlust-Prinzip, or more shortly, the pleasure principle. These processes strive towards gaining pleasure. Psychical activity draws back from any event which might arouse unpleasure. Here we have repression, for example. Our dreams at night and our waking tendencies to tear ourselves away from distressing impressions are remnants of the dominance of this principle and proofs of its power. And it's an interesting quote because hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit about dreams today as well. So what do we see here in this paragraph, right? I'm going to give a chance for someone to raise their hand if you wish. So I'll begin. I'll give the example. I'll be the student that constantly speaks, and maybe some of you will be convinced to talk later. So we see that Freud is saying that, in fact, he views unconscious mental processes as being primary. This has to do with his idea that conscious mental processes are secondary, and again with his idea that the ego itself is a secondary construction. For Freud, the unconscious mental processes exist in the psyche by themselves at the outset. There's nothing else. And what Freud says is that these processes are governed by a certain principle, which he calls the pleasure-unpleasure principle. You've heard about this principle, I'm sure. This principle aims at gaining pleasure and draws back from unpleasure. Now, Freud sneaks in the parenthesis there, saying that repression, for instance, is also a mechanism that is governed by the pleasure principle, because it makes sure that the psychic apparatus, let's say, represses whatever ideations that are unpleasurable and allows those pleasurable ones to reach consciousness. What Freud continues saying here, and that's a very interesting argument, that we see this work in dreams, in the way that we dream. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And also he mentions in our ambivalence, and that's an interesting notion by itself. But basically we see that the pleasure principle governs the psyche from the outset. This is what Freud tells us here. Now let's continue to the second paragraph and see what Freud continues to say. So Freud follows like this. It was only the non-occurrence of the expected satisfaction, the disappointment experienced, that led to the abandonment of this attempt at satisfaction by means of hallucination. Instead of it, the psychical apparatus had to decide to form a conception of the real circumstances in the external world and to endeavor to make a real alteration in them. A new principle of mental functioning was thus introduced. What was present in the mind was no longer what was agreeable, but what was real, even if it happened to be disagreeable. This setting up of the reality principle proved to be a monumentous step. So here you see Freud presenting his conception of the reality principle. And what we see in this text is that at the outset, and Freud talks about this a bit more in the paper, I've spared you some paragraphs, but I urge you to read the paper after this talk. Freud says that at the outset, the pleasure principle is pacified through hallucinations, right? So the baby hallucinates that it suckles the nipple of the breast, and that is enough, right? There's a certain tension, and it is pacified by means of hallucinations. But then Freud says, well, there's a certain point comes where satisfaction is not achieved through hallucinations. And then, only then, the psyche aims at making changes in the external world that would bring satisfaction. So we see that the search for the satisfaction of the pleasure principle is then directed to the external world, to the world of objects. Basically, later we will see Freud is presenting here a theory of libido. But this is what he says about the reality principle so far. So I'll just ask, and you can just nod because I'm seeing you. So you can just nod if you're following me, and we can continue. So can we take a few steps further in Freud? We have a question from Maria. So.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I basically wanted to ask then, when the pleasure principle wants to satisfy, according to Freud, it hallucinates. And when even the hallucinations are not enough for the psyche, it goes towards the external world. That's what you said. I'm not following what like, can you give any examples of how it would be presented when it goes towards the external world? Like, as in, we can say, as in, like psychopathy or antisocial behaviors. I'm not following that. How would it basically manifest in the external world?
Okay, so thanks, Maria, for this question. And I want to bring you back to the text, and I want to also emphasize there. Look at line number 3 in the second paragraph. You'll see that the psychical apparatus had to decide to form a conception of the real circumstances in the external world, right? So we are talking about a level of conceptualization of psychic representation. This is what Freud associates with the reality principle. Now, just shortly, I'll answer your question, Maria, because I think we should talk about this in the context of psychosis, and we can do this in a different lecture. But basically what we're talking about here is achieving a satisfaction, and we might even say a libidinal satisfaction, that is not autoerotic in its essence. Let's say it's not, a satisfaction that has nothing to do with the objects in the world. It is a libidinal catharsis of objects that exist, let's say, beyond the realm of the ego, right? So these are objects that cannot be reduced to the ego itself. Now, okay, we can really develop this because, let's say, Melanie Klein has talked about these partial objects in a very rudimentary way in terms of the mother's breast, for instance. So this is one way to look at it. Yes, so these are very sort of abstract investments in objects in the world, but also we're speaking about this world that we share, right? These objects that we share in the social bond, any kind of thing that exists in our shared humanized reality, right? So it could be anything in that way. And you'll see that soon I'll give this a little Lacanian twist in order to see maybe we can understand this a bit differently. One might say a bit better. But I think that at this point, what is important to grasp is the fact that the pleasure principle governs psychic processes from the get-go, and it's completely fine, Yes, up to a point where the psyche hallucinations do not provide the satisfaction that the apparatus required, and only then there's a certain level of psychic conception that Freud calls the reality principle, which is not then directed inwardly. Let's say, this is quite metaphoric to say, but Freud says here, is not directed to hallucinatory satisfaction, but to a satisfaction that is directed towards objects in the world. So this is what we have so far: pleasure principle and reality principle. Let us, I see another question from Mika, but we'll take a few steps, Mika, and we'll get back to more questions quite soon. So I wanted to go to the next paragraph that I brought from Freud, and it's from the same paper, but just gives us, makes a little further turn of the screw that might help us conceptualize what's going on here, and therefore we'll take some questions following that. So here is the paragraph on page 222. Freud is saying, actually, the substitution of the reality principle for the pleasure principle implies no deposing of the pleasure principle, but only a safeguarding of it. A momentary pleasure, uncertain in its result, is given up, but only in order to gain along the new path an assured pleasure at a later time. But the endopsychic impression made by this substitution has been so powerful that it is reflected in a special religious myth, the doctrine of reward in the afterlife for the voluntary or enforced renunciation of earthly pleasures, is nothing other than a mythical projection of this revolution in the mind. Following consistently along these lines, religions have been able to effect absolute renunciation of pleasure in this life by means of the promise of compensation in a future existence. But they have not by this means achieved a conquest of the pleasure principle. It is science which comes nearest to succeeding in that conquest. However, science too offers intellectual pleasure during its work and promises practical gain in the end. I think this is a very beautiful paragraph by Freud. But what I want to emphasize in this paragraph, and I'll ask you about religion and science here, so we'll see what you think about this. But before we get there, we see something very important. Freud is saying the reality principle does not cancel out the pleasure principle. It perpetuates it. So, in fact, it is not that one moves from pleasure to reality. It is that the reality principle comes to assure the satisfaction of the pleasure principle. This is its function. Now, I want to ask you what you think about this little lines that we have there about religion and science. What do they teach us about this relationship between the reality principle and the pleasure principle? If anyone wants to comment, would be nice. We're taking somewhat of a seminar form today, Michael, I think, than a course. Yes, Mika, and maybe you can also add your impressions that you wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. It will fit quite nicely to this later paragraph also. So I only wanted to note that in the first quote, there was an interesting expression of residues or residuum of something. And it was a bit ambiguous. Does he say then that this is sort of like part of the reality principle or the pleasure principle? In certain way, it seems like it's in between or something. And in the next, paragraph where he discusses about the reality principle being inserted, then these residues would be sort of like after the fact covered over, and I mean, we only see them after they have already been sort of like covered over by something. And to also fit the religious context, I was thinking of the Christian Eucharist, of eating the Christ, sort of like material remainder of Christ, some kind of real object that you have to swallow to accept Jesus in some way. So.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned this. If I remember correctly, Lacan uses this metaphor to describe the way that some psychoanalysts expect the analysand to eat them in take in this ceremony that, if I'm not mistaken, you eat the body of Christ, and in this sense you become part of a society of believers, right? It is a moment of fusion. And Lacan uses this metaphor to describe the way that some analysts see psychoanalysis as ending in this moment of unification, of identification with the reality of the psychoanalyst. I also want to say, Mika, it's a very good sort of point that you made there with the residues. And you tempt me to speak a little bit about my current work. I'm now mostly working on this notion of the skin that I'm developing in psychoanalysis, and what I call the dermic drive. And what I think generally about Freud's view of the psyche is that even the most primary processes that are psychic, that we call psychic, and these are unconscious mental processes, they originate in impressions that are made by the body. And this is what Freud called the drives, as sort of an element that is between the ideation, between the idea and the instinct. So it's not completely bodily and it's not completely psychic. It's something in between. The way that I read this is that the drives make these impressions on the psyche through our erogenous openings to the world. And these impacts that the body makes on the psyche, these impacts are the building blocks of the most primary unconscious processes that happen in the psyche. And this is why, for instance, I think that it's very important to think about the skin as a source of the drive, as a source of the dermic drive, basically because, the skin develops even before the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the anus. The fetus experiences sensations that originate in the skin, in the womb, even before it can hear the mother's voice from the womb. So I think it's very important to think of the skin as making these impressions, these residues that are the building blocks of our most primary psychic processes. So thank you for noting that. I see Rohdi, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, it's Roshdi. Yeah.
Mostly, yes. Okay. Yes.
I wanted to react about the paragraph we just read. So if I understood it correctly, there is no real opposition between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. What I kind of find interesting is that, so if I got it, for Freud, the reality principle stems from the principle of pleasure kind of applied to itself, as if it's when the pleasure principle reaches its contradiction and becomes a source of unpleasure, it is applied to itself and then creates like a more complex layer of pleasure that is the basis of reality. When it comes to the question of religion and science, I was a bit surprised because, I mean, if I got it correctly, both have a foundation on the reality principle in the sense that they both need us to renounce to our immediate satisfaction. But I would have thought that Freud maybe would think that the principle of reality is more on the science side, because maybe religion thought of as an illusion would be like an immediate hallucinatory satisfaction. While here it seems to me he says the opposite, that science actually provides more pleasure than what religion offers us. I don't know, it's a bit confused, but it sounds like it's a bit paradoxical.
Yes.
Given that he thinks of religion as an illusion, so
yes,
a bit unexpected.
Exactly, and this is a very good comment you've just made right now, because you are correct. Your intuition is very precise here, but what we have to do then is, let's say, realize that Freud's conception of reality is not so distinct from what he views as a fantasy. And we will see that very soon, right? We will see that very soon. And as you were saying here just now, Freud here talks about religion as perpetuating the pleasure principle through the reality principle, right? And it does so by offering satisfaction in the afterlife, right? Telling you, okay, right now you delay your satisfaction in this life and you will receive satisfaction in the afterlife. Freud says this is a projection of the workings of the reality principle, right? And you have noted quite accurately, yes, Freud thinks of religion as some sort of an illusion, yes. And so we have to reassess our conception of reality then. This is the point of today's lecture. The fact that there is nothing objective about the reality principle, right? Because we see religion and the idea of the afterlife. Well, is that an objective fact? Is that something that we can say is objective? Not so much. But Freud says this is an exemplary, even prototypical example of the reality principle, a projection of this structure. So we see there is nothing, in fact, objective about the reality principle for Freud. It is about what reality can hold together for the subject, what it can keep intact at a moment where one cannot achieve immediate pleasure. This is the question of reality for Freud. And then he adds here this little comment about science, which I find very interesting, and I'm always interested in hearing what people think about this. And he says here that science, and Freud wanted to be a scientist. He wanted psychoanalysis to be a science, but not a psychiatry, not a medical science. So it's an interesting twist there. So a unique kind of science. And he says even science, which is the so-called epitome of objectivity, in fact, offers intellectual pleasure, or the pleasure of practical gains for the price of the immediate pleasure of the work in the laboratory. I don't know if anyone here is a scientist, but this is you work very hard in the lab, but you promised a pleasure later. So Freud says that even science, what we might say, the thing that should actually be completely rid of pleasure, if we are Kantian, in fact, because this is what, let's say, Immanuel Kant wanted to happen to his philosophy, to his ethics. He wanted to exclude all affect, all pleasure, all satisfaction from it, be completely rational. Freud here goes against Kant. He is anti-Kantian here. He says even the pure scientist, well, he experienced intellectual pleasure. So that's a very interesting argument here. So I want to summarize a little bit of what we've done here in maybe a little differently. To prepare you for the torment of reading a paragraph from Lacan in a second. Okay, so because this was fun, this was great. I always say this was a lot of pleasure, but let's get ready for some reality. So we see here in these paragraphs that the psyche for Freud is first of all regulated by the pleasure principle entirely. Right? And this principle originally seeks to experience satisfaction through hallucination, through what he calls a hallucinatory cataxis of a memory of a prior satisfaction. So the child remembers suckling on the breast, and it hallucinates that it suckles on the breast, and that way the pleasure principle is satisfied. But then Freud says that the subject soon discovers that hallucinating doesn't relieve his needs, and then the subject is forced to form a conception of the real circumstances in the external world, right? This is the quote from Freud. This is what Freud calls a new principle of mental functioning that is introduced, and he calls this the reality principle. Now, what we see is that the reality principle modifies the pleasure principle, and it forces the subject to take a more indirect route to satisfaction, right? So the subject was used to taking a direct route to satisfaction, and now it's forced to take an indirect route to satisfaction. It is, not so much at this point that objective reality is introduced with a reality principle. Then what we see here is that some kind of a mediating substance is introduced to the psyche, right? Something that will enable the subject to delay immediate satisfaction in the aim of future satisfaction. This is the principle. This is what's going on. It's not, oh, now we know what is objective in the world. It is some, let's say, new mental function now mediates the subject's satisfaction and enables the subject to delay immediate satisfaction in the aim of future satisfaction. And this type of principle, clearly for Freud, is dependent on memory and the capacity to attribute satisfaction to a future projection, as we see in the case of religion, for instance, right? So we might say then that the reality principle is introduced when one gains access to a level of psychic representation that can be stored, right? That can be stored and enable the subject to conceive of a future. I would like to argue, and we'll see this very soon, that this type of mediating substance is in fact what we can call language in the wide sense, right? I don't mean the English language or the French language. I mean any medium which enables inscriptions in the psyche that can enable the subject to conceptualize a future satisfaction on the basis of past experiences, right? Something that is inscribed, that remains, right? And I told you that for me, this could also have to do with more bodily inscriptions. So it doesn't have to be, you know, the Kant's first critique. We're talking about an inscription. So when we think about this, we can say then, and I hope I'm not going to insult any animal lovers here, because I'm an animal lover, yes. But we can say that animals that we argue, let's say hypothetically, have no access to the reality principle, are in fact animals that exist completely outside of language. They only experience immediate satisfaction. They are unable to delay satisfaction for a future satisfaction. Basically, these animals have no access to the reality principle. Now, I just want to emphasize this before we continue, that we have to remember that the ultimate aim of the reality principle is still the satisfaction of the drives, right? The satisfaction of the pleasure principle. And this is why Freud argues that the substitution of the reality principle for the pleasure principle implies no deposing of the pleasure principle, but only a safeguarding of it. So the reality principle is the mediation of the pleasure principle. It is not outside of the pleasure principle. This is a point that I want to emphasize before we take another step. So let's check the nodding situation. Are we okay to take another step? This is a big one, so we're gonna take a big one. Okay. So we step into Lacan, and we'll see. We won't read a lot. I don't want to exhaust you completely. But let's begin with the first quote that I brought you from a lecture called Some Reflections on the Ego, which is a fantastic lecture that, well, if I'll do anything good today, it would be to get you to read it somehow. So I'll read just a teeny segment that I took from there, and you'll see it. That's quote number 3. So Lacan is saying, we must free ourselves from a naive conception of the reality principle and take note of the fact, though Freud may have been clear on this point, his statements sometimes were not, that while reality precedes thought, it takes different forms according to the way the subject deals with it. By dint of recognizing a little more clearly the supra-individual function of language, we can distinguish in reality the new developments which are actualized by language. Language has, if you care to put it like that, a sort of retrospective effect in determining what is ultimately decided to be real. So, any interpretations, any readings before I go on? Okay. So let me offer us a certain reading here, and it will be short. That's because you haven't commented, so it will be short. So we see here Lacan saying something quite clear, if you ask me. He says that there is a naive conception of the reality principle, right? And this conception is that there is one objective reality that gives shape to our thoughts, right? And when you gain access to the reality principle, you gain access to this one objective reality that gives shape to our thoughts. But Lacan says here that it is not reality that shapes our thoughts. It is not an objective reality that shapes our thoughts. It is the way the subject positions itself in relation to reality that shapes our thoughts. So it is the subject's position in relation to reality and not an objective reality that exists outside of the subject's scope that shapes our thought. Now, I don't know if some of you already have, your minds are going crazy with intuitions and thoughts, and I won't be surprised if that's the case, but I think that clearly we can say maybe off the bat that, you know, it is exactly, let's say, neurosis, which is a certain positioning of the subject in relation to reality. And psychosis is a different positioning of the subject in relation to reality. So what Lacan is saying here, that these mental processes, these mental psychic processes that Freud called primary and secondary, they're both determined by this position that the subject takes in relation to reality from the get-go. Now, the second step that Lacan is taking here is speaking about language. And what he says here, I cannot say that he copied this idea from me, yes, maybe the opposite, but he's saying something that I told you earlier, that language, or we might say the structure of language, is the way the position of the subject in relation to reality determines it. Right? So basically, Lacan is saying that when we talk about this position, this relationship to reality, we are in fact speaking about structures of language. And Lacan adds here something very interesting that surprisingly supports my previous claim, that language determines reality in this way retrospectively. Right? So the subject takes a position in relation to reality, and language is structured, and then retrospectively, one's reality is constituted in retrospect. So Lacan says here that language enables us to find a way back to pleasure without resorting to hallucination. This is a very exact formulation that I'm giving you here. I see Roshni again. We see you with a hand, so let's hear you out.
So I was just thinking, like, if I understood what Lacan is trying to say here. So could we put it this way, like, reality is not that which frustrates our fantasies because it is what it is, but it's actually what we try to construct to make sense of the unpleasure we encounter. Would this be like a fair account of what's being said here?
Reality is constructed because, poor us, the pleasure principle cannot function by itself. There is no way to gain pleasure without a relationship to reality. Or in other words, here we see that there is no way to gain pleasure without relying on the structure of language.
I might have a question about this relationship with language. So I was just thinking about this effect or trick in psychology. I forgot the name of it, but it goes like, we tend to remember unfinished tasks more than completed ones. And so the trick some psychologists propose is that when you have so many unfinished tasks, you just need to write them somewhere, and then you kind of trick your brain to think they are finished. So I was trying to think how we could maybe elaborate about this trick from a point of view of pleasure principle and reality principle. What is it that when we maybe put a word on some unfinished task in our minds, it's kind of, I don't know, puts it aside or it's done. I don't know. It's I really don't know how to think about it. It was just associating with it, or maybe not.
It's an interesting idea, but maybe to develop somewhere else. Yes, it's. You can definitely send me an email and we can think about it together. I think I read about that recently in Todd McGowan's new book. He speaks about that a little bit, but let's talk about this intuition later. Okay. So, are you ready for another Lacan quote? Mika, will you hold up for the next one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, because again, I brought these quotes sort of to support each other. So we'll see how the second quote gives us a little more from what we were trying to clarify with the first one. I'll divide it into the two paragraphs because this is a bit dense. So we'll read the first paragraph, I'll give you a commentary, and then we'll read the second paragraph. So this is Lacan in seminar 2 on page 60. And Lacan is saying, from when we started up to the present, Freud says, we took as a principle that the psychic apparatus, insofar as it is organized, is to be placed between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Freud, of course, in his thinking, isn't inclined to idolification. It never occurred to him that there wasn't a pleasure principle in the reality principle. For if you follow reality, it is only because the reality principle is a delayed action, Nachträglichkeit, a delayed action pleasure principle. Conversely, if the pleasure principle exists, it is in conformity to some reality. This reality is psychic reality. And here we get this term that Lacan uses and sort of will be helpful for us, psychic reality, in order to distinguish it from the reality that the realist speaks about. Now, Lacan here speaks of the Nachträglichkeit in Freud, which is a very interesting concept, many times translated as a delayed action. And this is Freud's idea that some experiences, let's say, that might be, let's say, colloquially speaking, traumatic, only gain significance at a later age when they can be, in a way, determined ideationally. So an experience that a child, let's say, this is an example, so let's say a certain trauma. I think Freud speaks about this case of this girl in the shop where the shopkeeper smiles and that brings her back. And then she sees a man smiling later. I see some nodding faces. Stephen is nodding. Maybe he's on to it more than me. But he gives an example for a certain traumatic event that happened in the past that only later, when it is signified, receives its traumatic value. So the child does not suffer from the trauma at any point, but only when this is recollected and mediated, the subject then retroactively signifies the trauma and then suffers from it. So this is an interesting subject by itself, but Lacan is using it here. Now, what we see Lacan saying, and this you already know, is that according to Freud, the psyche is determined by the pleasure principle and the reality principle. These are the two principles that Freud talks about in this paper. And then Lacan is saying, well, Freud is not an idealist. Yeah? He doesn't see the reality principle as being this supreme mode of psychic functioning that exists in isolation. For Freud, Lacan is saying, there is no reality principle that nullifies the pleasure principle. They always come together. But here Lacan adds something interesting, and this is the concept of Nachträglichkeit, the delayed action. Lacan is saying that the reality principle is the delayed action of the pleasure principle, because it gives us access to it in retrospect. So this means that there is no pleasure principle without some kind of a reality principle that gives us access to it. So pleasure does not exist in isolation. There is no psychic existence of the pleasure principle as we discuss it in psychoanalysis without the workings of the reality principle. So it's an interesting temporal dimension, we might say that, or logical dimension that Lacan is adding here to the relation between the two. So let's go to the second paragraph, and then I promise we won't do any more reading of Lacan. I'll keep the third one for you to read at home. And those of you that want to write me an email about it later are invited. So let's read the second paragraph here from Lacan. If the psyche has any meaning, if there is a reality which is called psychic reality, or in other words, if living beings exist, it is insofar as there is an internal organization which up to a certain point tends to oppose the free and unlimited passage of forces and discharges of energy, such as we may assume to exist in a purely theoretical way, intercrossing in the inanimate reality. There is a closed precinct within which a certain equilibrium is maintained through the action of a mechanism, which we now call homeostasis, which absorbs, moderates the eruption of quantities of energy coming from the external world. So, another really dense paragraph. To me, I promise you that after some years of reading Lacan, this is one that I would say is a very clear paragraph from Lacan. Yes, it's a very succinct one. Yes, I always say, reading Lacan is not only learning about Lacan's teaching, it's also learning to read Lacan. This is the more difficult part of reading Lacan, is to learn to read Lacan. Now I'll do the dirty work, and I'll offer you a reading here. What Lacan is suggesting here, we might say, is that what he calls psychic reality is, in fact, an internal organization that opposes the chaos that we theoretically associate with the flow of the universe, right? So in other words, we can say that it is a place where a certain law is maintained, and this law keeps the psychic apparatus at a certain equilibrium when it is constantly exposed to stimuli, right? It's constantly bombarded with stimuli. But this kind of law, this principle, maintains a certain equilibrium in the psyche. And what then we see here is that this law, this principle, is not the representation of the flow of the universe. It is not objective. It is exactly what goes against this type of incessant flow. So it is what goes against exactly this type of terrifying objectivity that Lacan says we can only speak about hypothetically, right? Because we conceive things, we succumb to the pleasure principle. There's no other way to do it. So in this sense, we see that it is some kind of interface that keeps things from imploding. This is reality for you. This is the function of reality. So in this sense, we see that objective reality is conceived by Lacan only as some sort of an imaginary representation of the chaos of the universe. And what he calls psychic reality is in fact whatever of pleasure, and I'm using a Lacanian term here, so whatever of pleasure is symbolic. Or in other words, the words that we use today, whatever of pleasure is mediated by the structures of language. That is reality for you. So let's go back to reality testing. So how would we reconceptualize reality testing then, when we've abandoned the naive conception of reality and we are now truly Freudian readers? We are true readers of Freud. We read Freud closely, and we have this conception of reality in our hands, right? So then reality testing would not be seeing if one has access to an objective reality, but it would be, let's say, asking if, instead of asking, what is the day? Are you Napoleon? What happens tomorrow? What is your job? Yes. Reality testing would be something more like asking, do you seek pleasure in objects? Or are you, on the other hand, solely disposed to autoerotic hallucinatory satisfaction? This is the Freudian way to do this testing now. Now, we can also say, do you take pleasure within the confines of the pleasure principle? Or are you disposed to some sort of psychic organization that establishes some stability in your experience of the world? And you see that even psychotic subjects can answer these questions positively. And we would say that, well, they are in fact invested in the world. They are invested in it narcissistically, but they are disposed to the reality principle. So who is out of reality then? So if that's the case, who is out of reality? Well, we might say that someone is out of reality if they are utterly unable to mediate libido. if they are utterly unable to mediate satisfaction, if libido is experienced firsthand, immediately, with no mediation, we might say that this someone is, well, we might say is out of reality, yes, but in Lacanian terms, we would say that this is someone who exists in the real. This is what Lacan called the real. I am, as you know, I'm also an avid reader of philosophy, and I think that Deleuze and Guattari had captured this idea with their work on the notion of the body without organs. So for them, the body without organs is some sort of subject in a state of becoming that is out of reality, does not succumb to the organization of the structures of language. And for them, that is a political aim, yes, maybe quite optimistic, yes. But then just if you're interested in this, I've published a paper about autism as being a true body without organs, and it's a paper that if anyone is interested in reading, you can send me an email and I'll send you a copy. Now, I have some more I want to talk to you today, so we'll go straight to it. Yeah, about this notion, this question of adaptation to reality. So, let's say commonly, if we might say that forcing a patient to abide by the reality of the analyst, well, this is a therapeutic relationship where the analyst would say, well, this is how things are. This is what will make you happy. This is how you should do things. This is the reality. Lacan has a very interesting quote where he says, well, analysts have this knowledge and they tell their patients, go up the Eiffel Tower, look at the beautiful view. It will make you happy. And he says that it is funny how many patients have done so only to jump from the Eiffel Tower to their death, right? Well, what we see here, or another way to understand it, is to see that adaptation, what we see here is a certain adaptation to the fact that, well, you know, if we understand it the way we thought about the reality principle today, an adaptation to reality would be an adaptation to the fact that we do things because they give us pleasure. That the world as heaven or hell is an adaptation of the pleasure principle through the reality of the objects that present themselves to me. So what would we, let's say, when do we then, if we keep this conception of reality with us, when do we lose our reality? Because Freud talked about the loss of reality in cases of psychosis, right? He talked about it in his paper on Schreber. He talked about it in his paper on narcissism. And he said that this psychotic experience an internal cataclysm that entails a loss of reality. And again, you don't have to believe me today. You can go and read Freud. You can go and read these papers, and you see that Freud says the loss of reality is the loss of libidinal cathaxis of objects in the world, and resorting to a libidinal cathaxis of the ego alone. This is what he calls secondary narcissism. This is what he calls secondary narcissism and associates with psychosis. And it has nothing to do with an objective reality. It has to do with gaining pleasure, right, through the medium, through a medium of language that is shared by subjects in the social bond. So the psychotic loses their attachment to these objects, loses his reliance on this principle and invents a different reality. A reality that Freud calls secondary narcissism, where the objects in the world, well, there is a relationship to them, but it is always goes through the ego. So here we have the paranoid delusions, for instance. The paranoid is very interested in the world. He sees everything in the world having to do with him. But this investment in the world, this cathaxis in the objects in the world, always goes via the ego. So the radio is playing a message for me, and I'm very much interested in that. And what we see here is a loss of reality in terms of the loss of this mediating function that language plays for these subjects that rely on it. These subjects that situate themselves in relation to reality on the basis of these linguistic structures. And before we end, we have some more time, that's good. I want to give you another example from Freud, because I said we'll talk about dreams today. And this is another example for losing our reality. And it might be an anecdote that might wrap things up a bit nicely. And this, you can find this, and today I try to be rely very much on Freud today and bring you a little bit of Lacan reading Freud, and not something sort of outside of it. So very early Lacan, right, very early in his career, where he was very much invested in rereading Freud's teaching. And Lacan also reads Freud's Dream of the Burning Child. I don't know if all of you know it. It's a famous case that Freud presents of a dream that one of his patients recounts to him. The patient is a father, and sadly this father has lost his child due to illness. And during the funerary ceremony, or the funerary time, where the child is laid in a coffin in a room, the father goes to the next room and falls asleep. He dreams a dream. And he recounts the dream to Freud, and he says as follows. He says, in my dream, I'm sleeping in this bed that I am lying on in this room. And my child comes to me, and he shakes my arm, pulls on my arm, and he says, "Father, can't you see that I am burning?" And at that moment, the father wakes up. This is what the father recounts. He wakes up and he realizes that there is a smell of smoke in the room. And he walks and he sees that actually a candle fell on the coffin, and the little blanket on the coffin is set on fire. He puts that out and everything is okay. But that's the story. Well, okay, relatively at least. And the question that we ask ourselves, and that Lacan asks us, is what woke the father up? What made him wake up? Now, you're already trained in thinking about reality. And what does the reality principle do? So many people would say that what woke him up is the reality of the external stimuli, right? He smelled the smoke. When we sleep, we still sense objective reality. He smelled the smoke, reality woke him up, and he went and he saw what happened. But Freud says that this is not the case. And you saw this in the quote that I gave you first. The dream mechanism doesn't work in this way. The dream mechanism is set on prolonging sleep. Right? It preserves the dream work in correspondence with the pleasure principle. So, for instance, if we dream and there's a certain external stimulus, this stimulus will be incorporated in the content of the dream. And we see this, for instance, in the child saying, "Father, don't you see that I am burning?" So Freud was saying that actually when the child says that, the dream mechanism tries to keep the father sleeping by saying, well, you're sensing this, but this is part of the dream. This is what This is your reality. Yes, you will continue being there. And I'm sure you know this from your own dreaming. Sometimes you really have to pee in the middle of the night, and then you dream that you're peeing. Yes. So you can sleep a little bit more. This is what Freud is saying. Or sometimes the alarm clock rings, and you dream about an ice cream truck with the same sound, and you keep on dreaming. Or, for instance, where I live, the trash trucks, they come early in the morning, and it really sounds like the people collecting the trash bins are really banging on them, making like drum sounds, tribal sounds. I don't know what they're doing there, but sometimes this incorporates into a soothing dream about a world war or something like that. So we see that the dream mechanism, whenever there's an external stimulus, it actually is incorporated in the dream. And Freud says that in the dream of the burning child, we clearly see that incorporated in the dream. The child says, I am burning, although the child didn't burn in real life. Yeah, nothing like that happened to him. So what Freud says is that the father wakes up when the dream takes a different route. When the pleasure principle cannot be preserved, and the dream goes beyond the pleasure principle. It portrays too strongly its traumatic core. And this is not something that is consciously portrayed in the dream construction. It is something that has been so painful that it has been repressed. It has been repressed, but it appears in the dream. Now, Freud speaks about let's say, the fantasies and the way that they appear in dreams in terms of a scene, right? There's a certain scene that is constructed, and the scene entails a certain obstacle. Something is hidden, something is repressed in this scene. It doesn't appear in the scene. Now, Lacan suggests that we read this when we think about film. So for Lacan, fantasy is an image put to work in the symbolic structure, like a film that stops exactly a frame before something very horrible is going to happen. Right? So the scene of the fantasy is this frame frozen before the point where the film is going to present what we cannot see, what we shall not see. So we might imagine that the scene of the fantasy that structured the dream, the image put into work of this father, played out the film too much, right? It played the film in a way that traversed the fantasy, that went beyond the obstacle in the fantasy, this thing that came to protect the father from his traumatic core. Right? The film played beyond the fantasy. The fantasy is the freezing of the frame before the traumatic kernel that is repressed. And what we might say is that in this dream, the film played too much. It played one frame too much. So what woke the father then? And this is the most peculiar thing Lacan is saying here, but I'll try to make sense of it for you today. Lacan is saying the father woke up so he can continue dreaming. The father woke up so he can continue dreaming. But it's not the case. The father didn't wake up and go back to sleep. That's not what Lacan means. He didn't wake up and then sort of said, oh, okay, back to bed. This is not what Lacan is meaning. What could he mean? Usually I give room for answers right now, and it's a very long discussion, but we only have a few minutes, so I'll just continue. Here we see that for Lacan, and the way that he reads Freud, and I think quite accurately, as we've seen today, that fantasy and reality actually have a similar structure. Right? We see that both fantasy and reality are constituted on the basis of the exclusion of the repressed. So when a fantasy is established, it functions as a permanent mode by which the subject can gain pleasure, gain satisfaction in relation to objects in reality. And in this sense, waking up, as we said, getting too close to the end of the film, to the point that the fantasy defends against, well, waking up from the dream would be the same as waking up from reality. What wakes the father up is exactly something that is unreal, something that is external to reality, something that cannot exist within the framework of reality, within the framework of fantasy. And it wakes him up because in order for reality to exist, this thing must be excluded. And this thing is what Lacan calls the real at that point. And it is the only thing that we can truly determine as wakefulness. Or for us today, we might say that instead of reality in this colloquial way, we would say real. So I'll rephrase it. What I was trying to say, to explain to you today is that reality, psychic reality, as we call it now after this session, is a phantasmatic construction which masks the traumatic loss that constitutes it. So fantasy is what enables the dynamic of both what we call sleeping, dreaming, waking, dreaming, and what we also define as psychic reality. And this is to say, and I got this little intuition listening actually to a stand-up by Louis C.K. A long time ago. This is to say that there are some moments in life that have no witness. And well, in the case of the real, it is principally defined as the unwitnessable, right? Being in this real is something that one cannot experience. One cannot experience reality when we oppose it to psychic reality. There is an interesting way to represent it mathematically with the asymptote function. You know, I don't want to really destroy your evening with math talk, but there's a thing that's called an asymptotic function. There's like the xy, and it goes like this. And there's a point between this function and that function, the point 0, let's say, which is out of the chart. It cannot be designated. And we might say that the father was dreaming, facing the real, which is something that is not able to experience, and then woke up to reality to keep on dreaming, to keep on being in a fantasy. Now, this kind of real, this reality that is opposed to psychic reality is something that we might say separates these two states, but it is indiscernible from the perspective of the axis, from the perspective of the subject. And Louis C.K. speaks about it in terms of dying. He says, quite in a joking way, one cannot live in the moment of dying. He says, one can never know, can never be sure how old they will be when they die. Because you might be dying and you are saying, oh, I have a few more minutes. I'm going to be 99 years old, but then you don't die. Or then you do. You never know. You never know. You can never know that. On the same note, and this is a huge problem for those suffering from insomnia, one cannot be awake at the moment of falling asleep. This is a huge problem for the insomniac, right? They want to be there, to be a witness to the moment of falling asleep. Basically, they want to be in the reality beyond psychic reality. They want to be in the real, an impossibility. So we see something crucial, and Freud says that when he speaks about dreaming, without using these terms, he says that we see that without the real, we would probably stay asleep forever. There would be nothing that would wake us up. And this shows you that there is something about death, yes, and you can take it with my example from above as well, that is a fundamental aspect of our psychic life. And then when we speak about reality, and on the same note we speak about fantasy, we see that it is exactly what sustains life in our psyche by allowing us to keep on sleeping, to keep on dreaming. And well, in this sense, well, demanding the subject to take part in this objective real is like demanding the subject to take part in death. It is impossible. I'm right on time, Mike. So I'll finish with some tiny notes that will be sort of like a sneak peek for the next session. And I hope to see you all here because we have much to discuss about this. There is an idea that the subject has to be situated in its psychic reality in the preliminary sessions of an analysis. This is the psychoanalysis that sort of I progress, that I belong to at school. Yes, so it's a psychoanalysis that doesn't demand the subject to take part in the real or take part in death, but it is a psychoanalysis that begins with a certain situating of the subject in psychic reality. Now, this does not mean reality testing. It's not a method of screening for madness, and it's also not an adaptation to a reality. What we might say is a pedagogical aim, an exertion of power, a moralism. It is a particular type of psychoanalytic intervention that Lacan calls subjective rectification. Now, what I want to suggest that in the next two sessions that we have on opposing reality, against yes, against this death that I was just talking about, we will examine two famous cases from the history of psychoanalysis. The first showing us how not to do it, and the second showing us how to do it. The first is a famous case presented by Ernest Chris. And this is a famous case that we might call the case of the man who eats fresh brains. And those of you that will participate next time, it will be a session about that. And I'll send you the paper as well, so you can read it as well, a paper from Ernest Chris. Chris makes an intervention in reality. And what we see is that this kind of intervention, adapting the subject to reality, can only end in the best of cases in an acting out. The second session where we will examine the way we would do this kind of intervention, we will focus on Freud's Dora case, the case of Dora, where Freud does make such an intervention very early on in the treatment, but he makes it in a way that is not completely free from his illusion of objectivity. And we see that this is what causes a lot of problems for Dora. So let's say that what we will do in the next two sessions is that, and with 3 sessions, we will end this, what turns out to be like a seminar against reality together. So we'll try and schedule that in the next few weeks. I'll stop here. And
sure.
Mike, yeah.
Thank you very much, Leon. I've actually really enjoyed the format. Also, I found with the text, I'd be interested to also find out with other people, because I could sort of open it and have it on my laptop with the video, which I found actually very, very nice. And the interaction throughout, I thought was actually very nice. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the next 2. It'll be nice if we can sort of keep a group, not necessarily a closed group, but it'll be nice if we can continue with the people that have attended this one going through to the next one.
Absolutely, Mike. Basically, yeah. I wrote this lecture for today, but as usual, it's easier to write more than less. But I thought that would be so interesting to go over these cases with the conceptualizations that we made today, that I thought about offering that we meet 2 more times in the future. So that's what's it. So it's a very comprehensive kind of 3 set of lectures.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Leon. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. And like I said, I enjoyed the format. It was, I'm looking forward to the next 2. So thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. My pleasure. And see you very soon.